Hi, y'all. I'm Dr. Roksana Badruddoja. I'm the chair of the Sociology department at Manhattan College. And together with the Office of Student Engagement, the Department of Sociology has started a new lecture series. And this particular lecture series is focused on grief. For today's talk and for the talks for the rest of the week, in the context of grief, we are going to be exploring suicide amongst young people, and we will be discussing how we can mourn people that we love. And so today's guest speaker is Dr. Gaurav Dekka, and his talk is entitled Non-Acceptance of Fate and its Systemic Repercussions. Before I introduce Dr. Dekka, I want to give a huge shout out to the Office of Student Engagement. Michael Steele and John Bennett are on this call. So if you all could just kind of say hi really quickly, that would be great. What I want to say about the Office of Student Engagement is that they have always supported my research for the past 10 years at Manhattan College. And John has been a huge supporter. And whenever I wanted to do something, he was like, absolutely, yes. So John, could you just say hi?
Thank you so much, Roxanne. I really appreciate that. And honestly, everything that you do for our community, we absolutely love it. And we're excited to have all the participants here. So we really appreciate it. And if I could also just add to something you said to start off as people are logging in, it is the first morning after the holiday, and the weather has been a disaster here. So I feel bad about that, but hopefully kind of people log in as this goes on. So thank you again for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And Michael actually did all the work to put all this together, because I just brought the ideas and I'm like, this is what I want to talk about. This is what I want the series to be. And Michael's been doing all the legwork. So Michael, could you say hi to everyone?
Hi, everyone. I'm just happy to be here and happy to be part of this great conversation. I hope everyone enjoys it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So Dr. Gaurav Dekka, he is an internationally, if you could all mute, please. Dr. Gaurav Dekka is an internationally recognized speaker, coach, and expert on childhood and family trauma resolution. He follows a systemic approach with all his clients and resolves them by using mindfulness-based methodologies rooted in neuroscience, somatic awareness, and breath work. He is also a pioneer in the field of family constellation and is the leading expert in inner child integration therapy in India. Because of his background as a medical doctor, Dr. Dekka brings an integrative and neurophysiological modeled approach for the complete wellness and mental well-being of his clients. I want to say a personal word, because that was part of his official bio. Dr. Dekka is one of my closest friends, and he is a freaking rock star. He completely changes the landscape of how we operate, right? So when we experience grief, we start developing patterns of being, and we use those patterns of being to operate in the world. And Dr. Dekka works to intervene in those patterns so that we can transmute those patterns into more productive patterns to show up in the world more fully and integrated in the lives that we have. It doesn't mean we're not going to experience grief. It doesn't mean we're not going to experience lost people in our lives. They are going to pass away. And so the idea is not to not experience grief, but how we can sit in that grief with fidelity and honor and dignity. So that's what I'm hoping to do with this. So I am going to turn this over to Dr. Dekka, and you all will see his amazingness.
Thank you, Roksana. That was an amazing introduction. Thank you so much. Before I begin, I have sent you the link that Gargi, one of our friends, she went into my account and generated this new link, and I've sent it to you, okay? So you may just want to have a look and see if you would want to post this in the chat box for everyone.
I'll take a look at it. You go do your thing, and I'm going to try to work on this right now.
Okay. Okay. So you can post it directly in the chat box. Okay. So I'll just go ahead. Okay. I do want to. 1 second. Yeah, I'll just in my video. I think it's already on record, so I'll go ahead with that. So as Roksana pointed out, that my talk is called Non-Acceptance of Fate and its Systemic Repercussions. And even though the title feels and looks complicated, I'm going to give you a simple story. Not a simple story, maybe a couple of stories. And I want to start with my own story. So I first came to know that, I was the second child of my parents, and that there is a, we need to mute the mic.
Could I please have everyone please mute? So Abhilasha, could you please mute yourself?
You can actually look at the panel and mute the mics yourself, Roksana.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Got it.
Or,
got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Got it. I did it. Thanks.
Yeah. Right. So anyway, let me begin. So I first came to know that I was the second child of my parents, and that to the living one, and that there is a brother before me, and there is one after me, who didn't live, who didn't survive. I came to know about that whole story in a strange therapeutic setting. At least it was strange for me when I first attended it. And while I'm not going into the details of the whole process, I just want to briefly tell you a little about that work, which later became my work, something that I work with. And my work is with systems. So what is a system? A system is anything that has parts to it, right? There are components to it. And all components come together to create a whole. And in the simplest of vocabulary, the whole, which is the system, is always, in some way, has more power, has more voice, and more effect than the parts that actually make it, the parts that make the whole. And initially, it was very difficult for me to understand this whole concept, to absorb this. But how I got into it was via my own experience. So I went in as a client to work with someone who happened to be a systemic therapist, to repair and heal the kind of sadness I felt as a child, which was inexplicable. And it was not the kind of sadness that you can give a reason to. It was that kind of sadness that I actually can't explain in words. I mean, when I look into my whole family, I realized that my grandmother was long dead, and my paternal grandparents had died before even I was born. So everyone else in my family were still alive. So what would happen to me is I would come back after school, and then I would go back to mom, and I would cling to her maxi and smell her moisturizer and her hand cream. And there was a particular hand cream called called Boroplus, and I would like smell it. And I would actually ask my mother if my father is going to be late, if Papa is going to be late. And I would have these stories in my head. Even as a young boy, even as a child, I would have the stories in my head that what if there is a bomb blast in Guwahati? Guwahati is the city I grew up in, you know, it's a small city in the northeast of India. It's in a state called Assam. Because everyone would talk about bomb blasts. Because there was the ULFA, ULFA, United Liberation Front of Assam, who were at that point a separatist organization. And they were trying to establish an independent sovereign nation state of Assam, the state I grew up in, for the indigenous people, Assamese people. And that was being done through an armed struggle. That is what led to the whole conflict, you know, all of these blasts happening across the town and city. And we would get to hear about these, you know, I would learn of stories where several people, civilians, would be killed. I have had friends whose mom and dad went grocery shopping or to buy vegetables across the road under the flyover and never returned. And they could see from their windows, you know, the walls of the shops breaking and black clouds blooming and mushrooming out of nowhere. And people's parts strewn and scattered. And it was very strange for me because I would wonder all of these things happening to my father, you know, in my stories. And this continued to my adolescence. The images of those fears changed, you know, as I grew up into an adult, the images of those fears kept changing. And they were no longer restricted to the images of my father dying or my mother disappearing and abandoning me, but an insidious form of grief about myself, that this life is not worth living. And I would have these sentences running in my head wherein I would have these voices which would tell me that I do not deserve to live, that nothing really good is going to come out of it, that one day I will lose everything and all I have to do is wait till that day, so it's not worth living. Well, in hindsight, because I worked as a therapist and someone who regularly helps people examine their thoughts and the source of their emotions, today I know what I really felt. I felt I had already lost something so close to me, something so intimate, that it was for me to live a half-life, a compromised one where you just wait to die, than a life that would be full, that would be rich, that would be blooming, that would allow me to embrace the life force and the joy that my parents brought me into this world with. And the reason for this unknown desire for a half-life, I would say, backed by a fear of a full one, became clear during a process called family constellation. It's a therapeutic process where a therapist, or you can call a facilitator, through what seems like a mystical experience, it's basically an inexplicable, unexplainable positioning of different people representing different family members of the client, brings to light certain hidden stories, hidden experiences, and unprocessed traumas from the family, from the system of the client. Often these hidden stories and traumas are not available to the client. They don't know about it because it's not in their conscious experience. It's not a part of their cognitive memory or understanding. these stories and these experiences are beyond what the client can recollect or consciously regress back to. They are present somewhere in the system, and we may not be aware of everything that is there inside the system. To give you an example, you may not know what happened 5 years back in the house you just moved in. You don't know who was fired and under what circumstances, and who was ill-treated at the new job you have just joined. You don't know how many bomb blasts may have happened and how many people may have lost their lives in a city. You know, you walk into my city, Guwahati, and it's so neatly organized with so many new towers and malls coming up, and you wouldn't know, that there are corpses and, dead human underneath it. You don't know who were the people who lost their children, lost money or property, sank into grief, took their life. In your own family, you won't know, because they may have happened many, many generations back. So for me, there were things in my system that I did not know. And strange as it may sound to you or seem to you, I was not exempted from feeling the grief that came with the presence of these things, albeit, of course, their absence, right? Because they were not visible. So I discovered my mother had lost a child before me, and it was a boy. And the womb where I found my life, and I grew up, it was already home to someone who had lost his life inside it. And when I was 2 and didn't have a fully functional prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that is responsible for understanding and being present and knowing the reality and knowing the facts, at that time, of course, I don't have conscious recollection. She went through a painful miscarriage at that point. The fetus was almost 5 months and he didn't survive. He would have been the third in the family. We would have been 3 brothers by now. And although as long as nostalgia guides me and I go back to spending days in school, worrying in abstruse paranoia that my mother would disappear. Somehow she would abandon me. She would go away. And then I would think of my father's death. And as I said it later, transformed into sentences like, I do not deserve to live. It's useless and I must kill myself. I realized that, we all take it on us beyond our conscious willingness to preserve what has not been grieved, what has not been witnessed, and said that this is what happened and I'm willing to feel it now. And we don't do that. Families don't do that. Organizations don't do that. Schools don't do that. Systems don't do that. When you go to a party and someone asks you, how many children do you have? And people say, oh, I have a boy, and then I have a girl. And you don't say things like, we have 4. The first one was a miscarriage and the last one died young on the 8th day. You don't say that. Because at least in India, you know how men react to such incidences. They literally and metaphorically turn away and they don't talk about it. Expecting men to talk in India is like expecting a log of wood to have a voice, actually. So some of them go, sometimes they have affairs. Most of them do not recognize it as a valid feeling because most of us probably do not identify grief as grief. We don't have the language to identify it. Women, on the other hand, they sink into a black hole, not know how to react or how to respond, right? There is no other support system except for other women in the family, at the in-laws. And if she has sisters, like my mother did, she had sisters. And then they internalize it. The compensation as well as the consolation often is the next pregnancy. That's how it's dealt with. However, as I said, the whole is greater than its parts and has more power than its parts combined. And therefore, the effect of these losses remain. They are not grieved. They aren't processed. And many of you may have questions like, but how do you do that? How do you process? And I say you process when you allow yourself to feel what you don't want to. We don't sit down on a Monday morning with our windows open, deciding not to have a cup of coffee or tea and feeling the pain and consciously deciding not to buffer by doing something, by eating something, by talking to someone, checking our emails, and just sit down and ask, what if I allowed myself to feel this grief? Where in my body would I be feeling it? Because I dread to feel what I think I would feel. I dread imagining how it would like to be to feel all those painful feelings, how it would be to give that feeling a name every single day and write the name down on a piece of paper: anger, fury, desolation, empty, numb, hostile, whatever you call it. And then let it stay there for as long. Because you know what feelings are? They are vibrations, they are sensations, they are waves that can be physically felt inside our bodies, sometimes in localized parts. And they rise like a wave and they have a crest, a summit, and then they begin to fall. And grief is one such movement which often feels unending. It's an unending, feels like an unending wave, because often it may lack a crest, it may lack a summit, a peak. It may be a combination of a lot of different emotions like anger and sadness and fear, hopelessness and desperation. And hence it has this ability, this strange ability, like a soul of its own, a will to stay and continue inside the system. So it continues. And what happened to me that I discovered through the process of constellation work, that I was in a way the carrier of that grief. The half-life I experienced, the desire to take my own life and belong elsewhere and not in the world of living, was a genuine feeling. By living a semi-alive, almost dead life, by finding opportunities to take my life, I could belong better and closer to my brothers. And the pull was strong. It existed like a strong force field in the system, and I could feel its effect. Not grieving or making that conscious movement of feeling those painful feelings, when you are a part of a system could be a family, an organization, a school, a university, a hospital, when we don't, not grieving or making that conscious movement of feeling those painful feelings, when we are a part of such a system, is actually not taking the things the way they are and the way they were. And I have had clients in the past who were in the most beautiful relationship and found themselves absolutely unable to initiate intimacy despite being in love. And many of them have had siblings who died young. Some had childhood sweethearts who lost their lives. Some had parents who took their lives. Some came from countries where there were wars, and their kinsmen and relatives who had lost land and property and children. Like I would have so many people who have had their parents or their grandparents back in Pakistan and may have lost everything during the partition while coming back to India. Some of them have had previous marriages and partnerships where their children did not survive, and some were aborted. And despite being in love and choosing each other out of their own will, out of their own volition, the emptiness they felt were unexplainable. It felt as if an external force had coerced them to feel these feelings. Some of them would end in divorce and they would still not know why. And they would call it falling out of love, which often is the residual energy of someone else's fate, someone else's experience. And that fate has gone unrecognized and unprocessed in what remains in the current. And then there were clients who were diagnosed clinically depressed, like I was, and some with unexplainable anxiety. You know, one I particularly remember was a doctor. She was a surgeon and had extreme angst against her parents. And even when there were no reasons for which she couldn't point out in therapy how they may have treated her unjustly, she still continued to feel angry, even though she had no visible, tangible reasons that she could state. And she didn't have the energy to drag herself out of her bed and go to the washroom. She didn't see a reason why she should live. She was 32 and unmarried and had already attempted suicide once by ingesting sedatives. And at one point, I had to stop working with her directly because I was sensing that she may not have the solution within the ambit of her knowledge. She didn't have the data that she was presenting, and the solution was not within that data. And I had to speak to her mom. And it was there that I came to know that both her parents, my client's mother's parents, had died while she was very young. The father took his life following a financial loss, and the mother sank into an endless pit and ended her life. The woman, my client's mother, could never think of it or go back to it and look at it, and in a way exiled her emotions from the whole experience. So what the mother couldn't feel or refused to feel, the daughter did on her behalf, including the anger that is completely unfelt, even denied by the mother. No, I'm not angry with my parents. That's what the mother says. They did what they did. They didn't have the provision to think about me. It was too much for my father, and my mother lost hope and courage. If I'm angry, that'll be unreasonable. I'll end up blaming them. That's not what I want to do. And that's how often we unfeel what we feel and what we would have felt without those walls of intellectualization. If we don't intellectualize, we will at least feel. And hence, the daughter was feeling all of it, who walked in as the client. And just like I was feeling what perhaps my parents couldn't feel, like one story leads to the other, there were other stories that emerged in my system for me. So while the fate of my brothers became my Gaizendetwa, there were other forces that had percolated down to our collective fate. The three boys, each gifted with a blanket of grief. My mother's father, meaning my maternal grandfather, had lost his father as a young boy, and he'd lost his life at 32. And from what I know, he was killed. My grandfather was 6 at the time. And if you notice, it was the same age, similar age at which I started thinking and feeling that I will be abandoned by my mother. My father is going to die. There is going to be bomb blast. So you can now see the connection that I was feeling, things that other people have felt before me without my knowledge. It was my grandfather who had lost his father at the age of 6, right? So my great-grandmother, my grandfather's mom, she one day went to the forest behind our ancestral house and hung herself. And my grandfather was a self-made man. He grew up fast and took up every possible work and business. And it is beyond any context, any kind of context for a man like him to sit down and feel those feelings. There's no time, right? Like it is beyond reason and context for, let's say, an organization or an office to mourn the loss of someone who died or someone who took their life. I mean, beyond the point, we don't feel like continuing. We can't, because there are other affairs to be taken care of, other affairs in the family to be taken care of. That's how we have been, that's how we operate. But does that mean that those who come later inside the family or in the system, they are also exempted from feeling? That they do not feel a secret force pulling them back into the void? Not in my life or in the lives of the clients that I have seen. Contrary to our strong belief in an individualistic society and in the idea of independent existence, that one has to work for themselves and live for themselves, have personal objectives, and that the winner always stands alone. And if you don't fight for yourself, no one will. It's a dog-eat-dog world. I want to propose a different idea. I want to propose a different truth. And the truth is, we are all lovers. And we love without knowing. And love doesn't seek the permission of your knowledge to exist. Peter Wohlmann, who happens to be a German forest scientist, writes in his book is called The Hidden Life of Trees. And it talks about how a forest is a super organism, and it will ensure that the tree that is diseased and ill is dying, it survives. It'll ensure it survives. The other healthy trees are all around. They pump nutrients and hydrate the one that is ill. And they make sure that it lives. Because if that tree dies, there goes something missing in the whole system. And you can say that the superorganism has lost a limb. Everyone has to come together in the process of balancing what is lost. So how does one balance the loss of one's own limb? When we lose someone, we think we don't know. We think, oh, they are far away from us. We think they are not connected to our fate, our objectives, our aspirations. We don't think like the forest. We feel it doesn't cast any effect on us. And to be truthful, at a conscious level, it doesn't. At a conscious level, it doesn't. But as I said, love does not rely on your intention or your deliberation or your will. It just is. It exists like fate. Love doesn't seek permission. Love doesn't seek permission. Fate doesn't seek permission. And the glue that binds all of us to one system is love. As shallow as it may sound, as cliched as it may be, right? It is love that brings forth the balancing act. And when I realized for the first time that we were three brothers, there was one before me, one after me, and I am the second one, I looked at my father's family. And this was much before I came to know of the tragedies of my mother's families, my grandfather's stories. I looked into my father's story, and everyone in my father's family are three brothers, including my father. And then I looked back and could figure out how traumatic events in one system can trigger an old wound in another member of that system. My father is the third. And his second brother, because in my system, I am the second. I have someone after me who is no more. So his second brother aligned with me. I am the second, he's the second. He had taken his life in a very similar way, like my maternal grandfather's mom. And so it coincides because just a year later, I was diagnosed with depression. And just a year later, I tried to take my life. So what I want to point out is that the traumas that happen around us and our lives inside this whole system, inside our families, our workplaces, our countries, our nations, they are not separate. We are truly creatures of love, and it is love that keeps this connection alive, that makes us balance whatever goes missing. We in a way follow them. And that happens because love is blind. Another cliche, but that's true. Love only wants to ensure one single thing. It wants to ensure one single thing, and that single thing is inclusion. It seeks to complete, it seeks to bring us together, it seeks to include. And I'm not saying that it's our fault that we withdraw, we forget, and we keep it aside. And sometimes we lock up that grief in a box and throw it in the ocean, because that's how we have been culturally designed to think. That's what people tell us, oh, forget about it. It doesn't concern you. It's not your story. It's none of your business. And to an extent, it's true, isn't it? What other people experience, the pain they go through, the way they choose to live their life or end those lives is not our business. But our business is to recognize that they aren't separate from us. Our business is to know that when a loss happens, someone takes their life or ends midway, or is unable to walk into the great, rich, abundant, full life as we do, it is important for us to bring into our conscious awareness the love that binds us to them. When we mourn and when we grieve, we don't just sit back and have 10 minutes of silence, blocked noses, eyes filled with tears, but asking ourselves important questions. And one of them is, how do I honor the fate of this person? Like I asked myself, how do I honor the fate of my brothers? How do I honor the fate of my uncle who took his life, my father's second brother? How do I honor my grandfather whose deep sadness I carry from the age of 6? Like my 32-year-old doctor client, she would ask, how do I honor the fate of my grandparents and that of my mother whose pain I carry? Like those that couldn't stay in the relationship despite being in love. How do I honor the lives of those who lost their husbands, wives, their homes, their children back in Pakistan? Like to so many people from Guwahati, my city, who lost their friends and the parents of their parents during the bomb blast, during the Alpha movement. How do I honor the fate of those people? And while I continue to live, because I'm living today. And there is no fixed process, no set method, or no true therapeutic standardized intervention to do so, to grieve and to acknowledge their fate. It is rather a non-intellectual internal movement. And it happens like love without a conscious will. However, just like love, when we make it conscious, what emerges to the surface is a feeling of they being present. What emerges to the surface is they being included. Like wherever I go, for example, I'm speaking right now here, and in my inner image, I have both my brothers standing side by side and they are included. The world I see right now, the world I communicate to as I talk to you, they see through me, they talk through me. And that is how I include them. This is how they are present in me. And even in a therapeutic setup, we ask the couple who has lost a child to include them in their world. To those who have lost ancestors to horrible events, we ask them to include them. The grieving is really and truly complete when we stop complaining why they left. Why did this happen? Why did they have to do that? And instead, we begin to look at what happened as fate. and make a movement towards honoring them. And honoring, by the way, is impossible without engagement, without acknowledging that the family you belong to, the institution you study and practice, the organization where you meet several ones like you, yourself, by recognizing that it's a system. You are not an island. You are in the effect of every other around you who exists, whether you want it or not. That's how human life and human connections are. We do not live on an island. There aren't individual lives and individual aspirations. We are inside a system, and there are systems within systems. And the way we can grow and live towards our fullness when we are able to include and honor everyone else in the system, even the ones who came before us, people who lived before us, friends who came before us, colleagues who joined before us, even the ones who are invisible today, and even the ones we know nothing about. And before you ask me, how is that? I want to remind you that it is not an intellectual exercise, and love isn't. But it is possible by our power to acknowledge that we aren't alone, and the collective exists beyond our conscious awareness. And we only honor it when we bow down to its presence, when we accept that it is present. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dekka. That was completely amazing. And actually, amazing doesn't cut it. It deeply resonates the ways in which we experience grief, and we often don't know like why we're experiencing this grief, right? And you've created a systemic context to it. I have some questions and some statements to make, but since we only have like a little less than 15 minutes, if there's anyone who would like to ask questions, please just go ahead and unmute yourself and please ask Dr. Dekka, and then I'll wrap it up with some comments. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to offer? Maybe actually what you could first do is just let me know in the chat that you'd like to ask a question. That would be great. Okay, I guess I will go. I first have a couple of comments to make. As you were speaking, I was just really reminded of my own personal experiences with grief. Oh, actually, I'll have Pradeep go, and then I'll continue. Pradeep, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes.
What's your question?
Yeah, hi, Dr. Gaurav. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you.
Yeah, my query is how do we stop a small child from following the way of, ancestors, maybe on the grief line or that thing? How to stop the small kid, like 3 or 5 or 8 years old?
So
thank you.
The answer is very simple. We don't work directly with children because children are representatives of the family, and children are the biggest flag bearers of blind love. So their love knows no logic, which of course we can see. Therefore, they are willing to carry everything for their parents. Not just children. I refuse to work with people below 25 because I know that they are carrying things for their parents, which probably their parents have not processed or haven't had the agency, haven't had the way to process. So I work with the parents, and we see what is the child trying to carry for the parent. And because the child, as I said, is the biggest representative of the system, so it just moves ahead in line, carrying everything.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And what I was going to say about this blind love of the child, very similar to you. Like growing up, like I've always had like this deep heartache, what felt like deep irreparable grief. And similar to some of the stories that you tell, I mean, when I was a teenager, I did try to end my life, and there was just so much grief. And you already know I'm almost 50, and I didn't find out until like my early 40s that I was a twin. Right. And so, my mom articulates, oh, well, there's two sisters, but in fact, there are three children missing in my system. And I was what I would call like a war-torn womb. I was residing in a war-torn womb because my sister had passed away. Right. So this grief is, what I was carrying. And you're right. When people ask how many children that we have, we don't say, we don't count the ones that are not here. I mean, I started, I think, a couple of years ago telling people I have 4 children with 1 live birth. Right. But my daughter who's alive and whom I raised, she has 3 other siblings, and they need to be included. And that's part of the way I practice, I practice my grief.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The question that I have for you is, what do you think, as you know, we have lost young people on our campus, and just recently we've had a young man take his own life. This idea of honoring grief, which is, by the way, y'all, what my talk is going to be about on Friday, how to honor grief. For you, Dr. Decca, I have to ask, what do you think should be an institutional response, right, for universities and colleges? What do you think is the response to our students who pass away by taking their own lives?
I would like to cover 3 points here. The first point is, when someone takes their life, we have to go by this knowing that they are entangled with a force which does not come from their will, their personal will. That force with which they're entangled with is a loss, tragedy in their own family. Like how I talked about my father's brother who had taken his life, and just 1 year later, it triggered something in my system. There were wounds already present from my mother's side, as well as my brother's non-survival, but it was triggered by an event because someone took their life. So what I want to say is, why can we not judge that movement? Why can we not judge someone taking their life? Why can we not say things like, how could they do this? That's not a good thing to do, or, it was irresponsible, is because it is beyond their conscious will to be enmeshed and entangled with a force that is way stronger than their personal will to live. And this force exists somewhere in the system beyond them, beyond their data, before them, most probably in another generation. So we have to understand that whatever they have done, it is an entanglement. That's the first thing, to acknowledge that. The second thing is, as an institution, it is so important to include, and by inclusion, I mean to give this person a voice, to be able to talk about them, to be able to tell their stories without inducing or reflecting fear or anxiety or desperation, to be able to communicate without the feeling of anxiety that this is who this person is and was. And they will continue to be part of this institution And they are as honorable as anyone else who studies in this institution.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
To be able to give their life and story a voice is what inclusion is.
Yeah.
And the third reason why we must do that is, third point that I want to mention is, an institution is a system.
Yeah.
Like I gave the example of the forest as a superorganism, and when one tree dies, then there are other trees who are affected, and the effect is beyond the tree's ability to think. That the tree cannot think. You know, it has a rudimentary nervous system. So I want to bring the same example here, that the same effect continues to remain and stay in the system. Other people in their lives in other forms are going to experience either anxiety or grief or desperation or some kind of emotional conflict if the one who's gone, the one who has taken their life, is not given a voice.
Right. Okay.
Right?
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Parts of a system repeat feelings of the ones lost in a system.
Right. Right. Supriya, I do see your hand up. I just want to continue this a little bit further. So, you know, our students in their grief demanded some time to think about what had happened on our campus last semester. Yeah. And, you know, our institutional response was, yeah, something really horrible happened, but we need to continue. And so students were petitioning to have some time off from their classes, and that didn't happen. And so again, like I ask you, what in this petition that students had, what should have been an appropriate institutional response to the students who are grieving the loss of their friend?
To give them time.
Yeah.
To give them time to process. We cannot process when we do not have space inside our bodies and our nervous systems.
Yeah.
How do you feel feelings when your nervous system is constantly triggered with fear and anxiety and desperation and hopelessness?
Yeah.
The real feelings are not those. Those are cover-up emotions. The real feelings are emotions of loss.
Yeah. No, I think this is
lost in space.
Yeah, some of us, you know, some faculty members, we did like suspend classes and we held open office hours to be able to just hold space for our students. But at large, you know, I think institutions in general need to do a better job, much better job. So, Supriya, you have a question?
Yeah, hi. You know, Gaurav, I have this question that, you know, we were talking about, you know, identification with our ancestors, and, you know, how, like you talked about how you connected with your uncle who was like at the same number as you were born. But like, is it possible for a person to identify with more number of people irrespective of, you know, the sequence of their birth? And also, you know, we are largely talking about, yes, the grief of the people who we have lost. But a lot of times you identify people who are still there, but you know, their griefs, their losses may not be really talked about within the family. But somewhere you feel like the same kind of energy that they have felt. So, you know, how you work around that?
So the answer to the first question, that is it possible to have connections? In our language, we call them entanglements. To simplify it, can we have connections to more than one person? And the answer is yes. That we may have connections to their traumatic experiences. Yes, it is possible through different ways by which we identify with them. That's one. The other is, trauma is not only feelings of anger, angst, shutting down, freezing, numbing out, and all these active shock feelings. But trauma are also the feelings that we wanted to feel during the time when the trauma was happening to us and we couldn't feel that. Like my body shuts down. Instead, my body wanted to have space. I wanted to cry. I wanted to howl. I wanted to scream. I wanted to say things in angst and, be as vitriolic as I can be in that moment, but I can't, because everything is this whole force coming from outside and turning us into, a capsule, a pebble where everything is locked. And this can be the response of our parents, of our uncle, of, our siblings. And as I said, that they did not feel, because it was forced from outside to inside, the feelings that they could have felt or wanted to feel. So now we feel on their behalf. This is why the reason we have so many, I'm digressing, but I just wanted to say this. This is the reason why we have so many ADHD cases, so many children having attention deficit hyperactive disorder, because parents have somehow not had the agency, the willingness, or a way to process their anger and angst or frustration. So the child feels on their behalf.
Thank you, Gaurav.
Thank you, Dr. Deka. It is, it's past noon. I do have a class to teach. So no, we will officially end. I'm going to stop the recording, but Dr. Deka, if you just want to, I'll hang out for like another 5 minutes. If Dr. Deka, would you be willing to hang out for another 5 minutes?
Yeah, another 5 minutes is fine with me, and then I can take leave. Yes.
Yeah, and same here, because I have to rush to class. So, all right, I'm going to stop the recording.